Welcome to the very last Minds, Technology, and Society seminar of the spring semester. Thanks, of course, to the Glushko and Samuelson funds for funding. So today we have Michael Frank from Stanford. He's an associate professor in the Department of Psychology. He's done, a lot of you know who he is. Mike has done he has over 100 papers on things related to development, cognitive modeling, meta-science, linguistics, all kinds of cool stuff. Mike is a really kind of broad-ranging thinker and scholar, and I was really hopeful he would talk about his meta-science research today, but he said no. Just to spite me, I think. No, he's got this really cool project going on variability, consistency in children's early language learning, and he's going to talk to us about that today. So let's welcome him.
Thanks very much for the intro. Identify where I put the clicker. So yes, thanks very much for having me. It's been a really fun day chatting with people. I've recently learned that I'm going to be data in somebody's study by virtue of my pattern of frame-to-frame coherence. So I'm going to be thinking about that in the back of my mind as I talk. So I want to tell you about an ongoing project in my lab that's one of a number of projects that expresses my interest in and commitment to building larger data sets for the purpose of theoretical synthesis in developmental psychology. I'll focus on this one and maybe provide a little shout out for one of the others, but the general premise of this work is that gathering larger synthetic data sets can have a potentially transformative effect within a particular field by cementing the basic framework of knowledge in that field. That's the promise. We haven't achieved that promise yet, so I'm not going to transform anything for you yet, but I'm starting the process of building that foundation, creating the data set, and I'd like to tell you about that and get your feedback, because this is work that I'm engaged in right now. So rather than choosing this talk to spite Paul, I did it for selfish reasons because I'm actually working on a book manuscript, and you're seeing maybe the first 4 or 5 chapters of that book presented. So feedback is extremely welcome. Let me begin by just reminding you of the centrality of language learning as a puzzle in cognitive science. How do young children, how do infants who are speechless and wordless very quickly become toddlers and preschoolers who can make their way in the world using language? This transformation is quick from a developmental perspective. It's quick even from a parent's perspective, and yet it's biologically unprecedented. Development of a flexible, hierarchically structured communication system that allows for complex social coordination and interaction. So in my earlier work, I focused on cognitive models of this system, really zooming in on small grounded interactions between children and their caregivers. And I tried to make models that were predictive of children's behavior based on observational data. And my thesis, I proposed one of these sorts of models in a Bayesian framework. I think this area really converged in a very nice way. There were a number of other models published around the same time that covered similar phenomena. But as I worked to build out my model further and think about its predictions, I realized I had run out of data as a modeler. There were 5 or 6 really reliable phenomena that people had measured in a fairly qualitative way with kids. And all of the models on offer were able to capture those phenomena, and we just didn't have the data to go much deeper from a theoretical perspective to distinguish alternative variants of the models. What I came to realize was that theory building in a serious way required substantially more data. So what I was modeling essentially was the mean. I was modeling children's vocabulary growth as we see it in textbooks. It's this increasing, maybe exponentially increasing function with age. And when I started looking at the actual data underlying these generalizations, I realized that mean, that central tendency, is an accurate summary, but it neglects the incredible variability. So I've superimposed on here data from the MacArthur CDI, about which more later. It's a measurement instrument for children's early vocabulary. And you can see that each dot here, as an individual, reflects the tremendous variability in early language. In some sense, we can describe this by saying that children take many different routes into language. And what we want to capture with our theories is both what is consistent, that central tendency, but also what's variable. So classically in developmental psychology, particularly in language development, we've been the locus of these great debates on the structure of knowledge and the origins of knowledge, and that debate has typically gone between nativist and empiricist, and also kind of domain-specific mechanisms, domain general learning. And in my career, I've been inspired by work on both sides of this debate. On the nativist side, there is an inspiring proposal that we can look for the universals that characterize the human language faculty across languages, across cultures. And in the earliest versions of that proposal, there was a laudable search for structural universals in grammar, typological universals across cultures, and universals in the form of principles and parameters types approaches in acquisition. On the other hand, there are many critiques of this approach based on its limited contact with quantitative and empirical data from infants. On the other hand, I actually got into studying language learning because I was inspired by work on statistical learning, which provided accounts with concrete computational detail of how knowledge could be acquired from experience. On the other hand, statistical learning theory, for better or for worse, has largely been a theory of cognitive universals without much regard, notable exceptions, but without much regard to the variability across cultures and languages. In some sense, when you think about early language from the perspective of consistency and variability, the continuum from empiricism to nativism is one possible continuum, but it's, if not orthogonal to, at least not in the same axes as the project of trying to understand variability. And so what I want to do is try to sidestep some of these great debates and instead project into a slightly different space, which asks, inspired by those two poles, about, if not universals, at least consistencies across languages, and the quantitative measures that can be derived from actual data with individuals about the sources of the variability between individuals and between cultures. So we're going to try to search for consistency across languages and across individuals, characterize the variability across languages and individuals, and then try to, using those data, constrain hypotheses about developmental process. And the first two I'll do. The last one is a promissory note. This is the eventual goal. So my inspiration here is the original big data in cognitive science. Right? Folks in language learning were doing it far before it was cool. Brian McWhinney and Catherine Snow were photocopying transcripts of the Brown corpus in the early 80s, making open data freely available to other researchers. Seriously, and they created a standard with metadata and open sharing for the child language data exchange system way before this was on the radar of other subfields. Similarly, Liz Bates, Larry Fenson, their collaborators who developed the MacArthur Bates Community Development Inventory, were interested in variability, were interested in large-scale descriptions of child language, and distributed those data freely far before that was the cool thing to do. And I'm really inspired in particular by Liz Bates's work in this area. So she really thinks about, in her writing very explicitly, using variability between individuals and cultures as a signal to inform theories. So I'm going to read you this quote because I think it's so cool. Far from simply reflecting noise in our measuring instruments or variability in low-level aspects of physiological maturation, the variations that we will document in vocabulary development are substantial, stable, and have their own developmental course. Because this variation is substantial, it's critical for defining the boundary between normal and abnormal development. Because it is stable, it provides a window onto the correlates and by inference the causes of developmental change. And because it has its own developmental course, it can be used to pinpoint critical developmental transitions that form the basis for theories of learning and change. So I think that's the promise of characterizing variability from a quantitative perspective. And the instrument that Bates and her collaborators developed is a good one for beginning this process. So the MCDI or the CDI is really simple. We call it an instrument. That's glorified terminology. It's a checklist. It's a bubble sheet. You give it to parents. It's got a list of vocabulary items on it. The earlier version is words and gestures. It has like 400-ish vocabulary items. And you say, does your child say or understand, say and understand or just understand this vocabulary item? Do they gesture communicatively? Do they point? Do they do this kind of stuff? The later form has a few more words. It's called words and sentences. It's got 680 words in English. It asks questions about grammar. Is your child combining words? Does your child say something more like, want ice cream or I want some ice cream? These sorts of kind of rough grammatical anchors to characterize behavior. Surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, I think surprisingly, these are reliable and valid instruments. So in one study by Mark Bornstein and colleagues, they characterized child language developmentally, in longitudinal fashion using parent report instruments, in-lab elicitations which were transcribed, and vocabulary tasks with a pointing dependent variable. In the structural equation model, all of these tasks correlated very highly with one another, all these measures. Early language is largely a unitary construct. It gets better as a whole, and I'll show you some evidence from that. But in the CDI, or I think it was maybe even a proto-CDI, but the vocabulary checklist in that study was the most highly correlated with the other instruments in the study. So it's also been shown to be predictively valid, concurrently valid. It relates fairly well, especially for older kids, to pointing type tasks. It's a pretty good thing. And why is that? Parents are actually remarkably good concurrent observers of their child's behavior. They spend a lot of time with their child, and they can report on the things that their child does when asked about it appropriately. They are not good retrospective reporters. They show a variety of biases there, but they're not bad concurrently. Of course, parent report is not perfect. Probably what they're doing when they report on their child is kind of a mix of thinking about whether a word is difficult, thinking about their general ability of their child, and actually recalling individual instances of comprehension or production. So they're probably kind of confabulating a little bit and thinking like, is alligator the kind of thing that Madeline would say? Or did I actually remember her saying that? So it's not perfect, but it's not bad. They're both measurement error issues and opportunities for bias, and I'll point some of those out. It was also, the CDI was not designed to be valid at the item level. We're nevertheless going to use it to make inferences about individual words, but individual words for individual kids may be kind of more of a composite type thing. And finally, I just want to mention that comprehension in particular has been argued to be problematic here. So asking, does your 12-month-old know what under means? Maybe that's a hard question to ask, and there have been arguments that it is. Just to satisfy my own curiosity here, and maybe a small number of CDI aficionados among you, we did some psychometric analyses of the CDI using what are called item response theory models. So these are psychometric models where you try to fit a function to individual items. The idea is the probability of a child getting that item correct should be related to, an item here is a word like alligator or ball, should be related to their latent ability. And so a good item should discriminate kids with lower ability from those with higher ability via this kind of logistic function. A steeper slope means it's a better item because it better discriminates less able kids from more able kids. This is kind of general test theory. If an item has like really bad slopes, it's not discriminating, older kids from younger kids or better language from less good language.
So in the survey that the parents are filling out, is that done kind of like they're in a lab or at home, but they're not actually interacting with the child while they're trying to figure these things out, right?
Good question. Method of administration varies here a lot. Sometimes it's given by an experimenter in the lab. Hopefully, it takes like somewhere between 15 minutes and half an hour, so hopefully somebody's distracting the kid if they're doing it in the lab. Sometimes it's given over the phone, sometimes it's mailed home, sometimes it's done on the web. I'm going to be aggregating across a lot of administration methods. In our studies, we don't know of major biases due to administration method, other than if you do it in a sloppy way, you get more bad responding. But I don't have a good way, I don't have a lot of ground truth to get at that, because a lot of the time what I'm getting is somebody else's data set.
There aren't people that use the approach of kind of like letting the parent interact with the child to figure out what, over some course of time, to figure out more accurately or maybe less accurately, I don't know, they might influence them by saying those.
Standard CDI administration instructions explicitly discourage parents from going, hey Johnny, say ball. Okay, check, he said ball. Right? We try to get parents not to do that. In different conditions, you get different proportions of like bad responders who say their 12-month-old knows 700 words. Those do show up. You can usually see that they're weird outliers. Most of the data sets I'll show you don't have those obvious clusters of outliers, suggesting that some care was taken. So most of the data sets that I'm going to show you come from groups in various countries that are trying to develop their own version of the CDI. And so they've conducted multiple norming studies, first to identify words and then to test out and create a large normative sample. And so they're really very focused on the measurement properties of the instrument rather than using them kind of as a thrown-in measure for some other study. So they're, at least in principle, they are the local experts on this form and are trying to do it right. But your mileage may vary. So we fit these kinds of item response theory models in order to try to understand the distribution of slopes and intercepts for words. So the distribution of slopes for words tells you a little bit about kind of generally how diagnostic the words are of a latent construct. So if you've got a bunch of slopes that are, so this is a pretty steep slope. If you've got a bunch of slopes that were kind of flat, that would mean you had a bunch of bum items. And there are a few of these, like the item camping, I believe is in here, and it's a terrible item because some kids just don't go camping before age 2.5, and they don't know about it, they haven't read a book about it, and so they may have great language, but they haven't encountered camping because of socioeconomic issues or because of the region of the country they live in. Maybe they live in an urban area. Mittens, another one that just you shouldn't be on there. So these are words, California kids don't know what mittens are, it's fine. Those low slopes are going to be an indicator of bad items or bad responding. So here are the intercepts and slopes for production and comprehension. So let me walk you through this. So the intercepts for these functions tell you about how the distribution of hard and easy words. And what you see here is for production is harder than comprehension. Kind of everybody knows that. Kids understand language before they say all that much. And so you've got a lot of these really pretty far negative slopes. These are kids up to 18 months, and a lot of them aren't saying that much, but they still understand. Comprehension has this kind of nice normal distribution here, so there's some hard words and some easy words, that's good. What about the slopes? Well, production has pretty good slopes. They're almost all above 0, and so that's a good thing. Mittens isn't, but the rest are. And some of them are really quite good, like for example, the item table is really diagnostic. If your 18-month-old knows table, he or she is like above average. That's a great diagnostic. But interestingly, here's comprehension. There's this like kind of long tail of cruddiness here. So there are some items that are really cruddy, but the rest are actually not bad. They're just not as good as production. On average, we're kind of estimating a little more when we say, does our child understand this word? But there's some signal there. If you're interested in what these words are, it's stuff like mom. Ask any parent, does your child understand mom? The answer is yes. Irrespective of age or ability or anything else. That's like not a good question to ask, but you don't want to leave it off the list. So if you break down these slopes by lexical class, it turns out even adjectives, verbs, even function words, they're all kind of non-zero, and they're all distributed around. You can ask parents whether their kid knows the word under, and it's probably not giving you a huge amount of signal about that individual kid, but it's also not informationless. It relates to that kid's latent ability in a systematic way. So for me, these analyses with slopes generally, kind of more in the 1 to 3 range is actually quite comforting from a psychometric perspective. This instrument hangs together, it's got decent measurement properties, even for young kids, even for kind of complicated word types. That's all I want to convince you of here. We can come back to some of the other biases and imprecisions of the CDI as we go.
Is that collapsed across comprehension and production?
So no, this one is just comprehension actually. So yeah, so that these kind of this decent distribution is even for comprehension. So, okay, so you can ask kids, you can ask parents about their kids and get back decent data. All right, why use the CDI? Okay, now we know why you might want to include it as an early language measure in your study. But as a data analyst, there's a tremendous opportunity. CDIs are really cheap to administer, and that means that many groups around the world have created adaptations for their language and spent a lot of effort creating large data sets for all of those languages. In fact, there are more than 90 adaptations out there. Here's just a small smattering of those. So that's a really big opportunity for the community, because there are tons of data out there on early language development with pretty good instruments across cultures. Wow, we could really learn something about what language development looks like in these other contexts, beyond the classic university town in the Midwestern US or whatever we study. Okay, so with that premise in mind, my collaborators and I began work on a website called Wordbank. Wordbank is an open repository, a database of CDI data. And we archive data now from, well, that's the static version. Let me go to the live version on your UC Merced network. From 75,000 kids, 82,000 administrations, 29 languages or dialects, and 56 different instruments. So we've got data from a fraction of the CDIs that are out there, but many of the major languages where the CDI has been adapted and studied. So some of these are kind of obvious ones: American English, British English. But we've also got Norwegian, Danish, European Portuguese, Turkish, Mandarin, Taiwanese Mandarin, Mexican Spanish, Beijing Mandarin, Korean, Russian, Slovak, Australian English, Swedish, Cantonese, maybe, German. No, that's Cantonese, I can't read that. Italian, Latvian, Croatian, Hebrew, Czech, down to American Sign Language, British Sign Language. So this is now a big data set by psychological standards, if not by machine learning standards. And we can use this to explore the nature of the data. So in our work, we've begun by creating interactive tools. Oh, and let me mention, before I tell you about all the cool stuff, this is due to the generous contributions of a tremendous number of people. So we have citations linked to each of these data sets. And so you can see that, just ASL alone is linked to, to a number of papers. Cantonese, Croatian, each of these have a study and a history and often a paper describing the original research. And so I want to thank everybody who contributed, as well as anybody in the room who uses the CDI and would like to contribute and be part of this data set. So we then can do some kind of fun stuff with these data. So the first thing we did was create a bunch of browsers where you can look at different aspects of the data. So you can select a language, maybe you want to look at Danish, and look at normative patterns of growth in production, which early on from 8 to 20 months is pretty low, or comprehension. And you might want to break these down by something like gender. We'll come back to this, but you can kind of see here there's like a female advantage over males in this data set. So that's kind of one usage of these data. Or maybe you're doing a study on early language, or maybe using early language. Maybe you have items in your study and you want to have objects that you know that the kids can or can't name. So you could look up things like table, my favorite, or alligator. Or cow or something, and get information on the general patterns of growth for individual lexical items. Or you could even look at kind of fancier stuff like the lexical networks that are growing out of children's initial competence. So, your early network, which has mommy and daddy here, grows slightly as children learn more content words that are connected to one another semantically, like nose, eye, ear. Don't know why Yum Yum shares features with ear, but it might. That's good. And these networks can really get quite elaborated. And so these have been one application area for CDI data of this type, is using lexical networks to predict aspects of child language vocabulary growth in typical and atypical development cases. So there's lots of kind of fun stuff you can do online and interactively. But where it really gets fun, from my perspective, is to actually systematically apply these analyses across the entire data set. So that's what I'm going to tell you about now. And this is part of my current sabbatical project, Wordbank the book, which is due to MIT Press this summer, and so progress better happen soon. But feedback is very welcome because this is still very much a work in progress. And I should have mentioned this more at the beginning, but all of this work is collaborative with my 3 co-authors here, Mika Braginski at MIT, Virginia Marchman is also at Stanford, and Dan Urofsky is at Chicago. Okay, so in particular, the research strategy that we've outlined using this data set aims to look at this issue of consistency and variability that I mentioned. So what I'm going to try to do is identify some phenomenon of interest in early language, casting a net pretty broadly. I'm going to quantify that, and then I'm going to quantify its variability across languages. And at the end, I'm going to try to place these phenomena on a continuum of consistency and variability. So from a quantitative perspective, in some sense, your universal is my consistency. Your cultural and language-specific phenomenon is my variability. It's one axis to try to capture this kind of locus of traditional debate. And so that continuum is going to tell us a little bit about which of these phenomena we should expect across different languages at a minimum, and it may also sketch out some of the mechanisms of learning and developmental change that we should be interested in our further investigation. Okay, so there are a couple phenomena that I want to tell you about before I start to kind of bring them to scale, just to orient you to some of the stuff that we care about in early child language. So one phenomenon that's been discussed a tremendous amount is the early bias towards nouns in vocabulary. So this is a figure from Elizabeth Bates. So this is the size of the child's production vocabulary here, and then the percentage of it that's taken up by nouns, predicates, so that's verbs and adjectives, and then function words. And you can see that kind of big obvious phenomenon here is that nouns are overrepresented relative to the total proportion on the form, which is given by the data. So why is that? Well, there's a huge literature here that pursues a number of different explanations. Nouns are more frequent often. They're more concrete often, but not always. So the concreteness of the nouns, kind of the basis of Dedry-Gentner's division of dominance hypothesis, the idea that they're concrete and grounded in the world and hence potentially easier to learn from observation. They're maybe easier to learn cross-situationally by aggregating statistically without syntactic information. That's kind of like a syntactic bootstrapping, Gleitman type account. They're often less morphologically complex. There are also cultural explanations because East Asian cultures have been argued to have fewer nouns in early vocabulary, and so maybe holism is to, or other aspects of parenting style that vary between the US and Europe on the one hand and East Asia on the other might be to blame for this, or maybe it's linguistic difference between East Asian languages and European languages. So there are a lot of accounts out there. That's just a kind of smattering of these. But this is one type of phenomenon that we could attempt to quantify across languages. Here's a second phenomenon, again due to Liz Bates actually. So the question here is whether syntactic structures emerge out of generalizations for individual words and phrases, or does syntax emerge on its own maturational timetable, as proposed by accounts like principles and parameters. So on those sorts of accounts, you might see specific syntactic milestones which are relatively unconnected to vocabulary. In contrast to that second type of account, but consistent with the first generalization-based account, Bates and colleagues observed this quite strong correlation between a child's vocabulary size here on the X and their grammatical complexity score on the CDI on the Y. So these are two kind of anchoring phenomena that we'll eventually be interested in terms of their cross-linguistic variability. Yes.
Sorry, this is pretty outside my wheelhouse, but my question is, with regards to vocabulary size and grammar, or grammatical complexity, or something along those lines, both those seem to correlate with age. Is there a correction for that? Like, it seems that, as you grow older, you're going to both have more words words and greater?
Yeah, that's a great question. In these initial studies, there was not a correction that I know of. At least the kind of pattern. I have to go back and look if they did this. We certainly have done that correction, and I'll tell you a little bit about it because you're interested. Okay. So here's a warm up on the strategy. So those are the phenomena. These kind of two big phenomena, but I'll show you a warm up on the strategy of looking at variability with easier phenomena. So here's sex differences. So this is kind of what we're doing, right? So we plot out, this is productive vocabulary by age across the languages in our data set for which we have this particular demographic variable. And what you see is females in red and males in blue. And you see that the red is above the blue for pretty much all of the languages. Italian is a little weird. Okay, but they mostly look kind of like red is above the blue. So now we can quantify that. We can ask, what's the magnitude of that difference? So it's kind of big in Croatian for whatever reason. Then it's pretty similar kind of down the line. And then Italian, it's like kind of 0, and there's a little reversal in Hebrew. We don't know why. But this data set looks kind of like it's kind of got some ceiling effects happening here too. That's the kind of, so we've taken this analysis, this is the analysis, applied it across languages, then taken some summary measure, and now we're looking at that, and now we can just simply capture the variability in that summary measure across languages. So I'm going to use the coefficient of variation, so the standard deviation divided by the mean. Yes?
I'm just curious, because like Morgan says, this is really my wheelhouse. Why is it that females generally learn more words than males?
Yeah, great question. So I don't know. I knew, it's in all the textbooks for English, and I always thought, well, okay, let's talk about chicken and egg. Let's talk about reporting bias. Let's talk about kind of a variety of other things. So yeah, what kind of hypotheses can we put forward? We could talk about just pure reporting bias. We could talk about kind of cultural biases in terms of interaction style or something like this. We could talk about sort of more, I call it an interactional account, something like gender differences in interactional style or ability might relate, which is known to drive vocabulary. Those gender differences might then translate into vocabulary differences because of, sort of greater social cognition on the part of the girls. So I can rule out the reporting bias here for you. So in that Bornstein study that I mentioned, they have these non-parent report measures, and I estimated the effect size from the non-parent report measures, and the gender effect size that they observe is essentially identical to the English gender effect here. So that's kind of comforting. I was kind of thinking, we might see variation in the size of the gender bias with respect to kind of variations of cultural standards towards, attitudes towards women. That doesn't seem to obviously fall out here. What I see instead is like a kind of broad swath of consistency across quite disparate cultures in terms of relative traditionality of the gender roles. So that doesn't seem like it's well supported by these data. Not sure, but so you could zoom in a little bit further. I don't have these data in front of me, but you can look at the individual lexical items and the boost that they get for girls relative to boys. And you see two very distinct signals in that analysis. One is there are gendered words, like girls say doll 2 standard deviations more than boys, and boys say truck 2 standard deviations more than girls. And then there's also all the rest of the words, which are moved about 1/3 to 1/2 a standard deviation in the girl direction. So there is gendered vocabulary, and then there's all the rest of it, which girls kind of uniformly do a little bit better on. To me, it sounds like the gender socialization stuff kind of has its impact through these particular loci of interaction, like trucks and dolls and dresses and this kind of stuff. And there's huge consistency in the the doll dress type stuff, apparel, and the general category of girl gendered toys across languages. Those are the words that girls know most better. But this other shift, appears to be somewhat independent of those factors. And so my money is leaning towards the interactional socialization, or sorry, the interactional ability hypothesis, that gender proxies for differences in the distribution of social abilities, which in turn drive vocabulary. As you can tell, I'm working on this chapter. So each slide here is like an entire chapter. So if you open you open that folder, you get the full suite of analyses that I've run on that. But yeah, so it's a really interesting question. For the purpose of this talk, close that folder back up, because this is just some measure that you can define on the data set and then look at its variability across cultures. And I would say this is relatively consistent. It's not the most consistent thing, but it's pretty darn consistent. So you extract the coefficient of variation across languages. So, okay, gender we got. What about socioeconomic status? As proxied by maternal education, which is a rough proxy, but one that works cross-culturally better than, say, income. What do you think? Consistent or variable across cultures? Variable, okay. Yeah, you could play it both ways. You could say this is a proxy variable that actually, might have a similar effect across cultures. Yeah, right. They're kind of consistent correlates of poverty or low socioeconomic status, right? Stress, kind of low stimulation in childhood, and so forth. But it turns out that probably those are buffered by a variety of things in the political and sociocultural context. And so if you plot the kind of fan of socioeconomic status via maternal education for vocabulary, the width of that fan is going to tell you about the differentiation between low maternal education and high maternal education vocabularies. And you can see it looks a bit bigger in the US data than anything else's, which is, kind of a shame. Latvian also looks kind of big. Danish, European Spanish, European Portuguese, Norwegian, not so big. So these data are preliminary in many ways, not least of which because the data are sparse in the less than secondary education. That's unfortunately not due to the sparsity of maternal caregivers with less than secondary education, but the sparsity of data collected in that context. But the suggestion is that this socioeconomic fan is different in different countries, and all of these are probably dramatic underestimates of the actual width of that fan. Okay. So then you can kind of summarize this and look at its consistency or variability, and you can kind of get the intuition that although there are fewer data points represented here, it didn't have that kind of consistent mean. This is actually like, that goes down to almost 0 and kind of up to almost 4, so there's kind of a big standard deviation there. German, interestingly, has a big college to secondary gap, but a small secondary to below secondary gap. I don't know what to make of that, but so there's some analytic details here that matter. Okay, so those are two kind of case studies that we can check out. Now let's get on to something theoretically a little bit more meatier, and this is one analysis that hasn't, to my knowledge, been done before, and I think is super cool. So I'm excited about this. So remember, I started with this kind of picture where there are a lot of dots all over the place, basically. So we've got age again, and the number of words that kids are producing, and I showed you, right, okay, there's the kind of median line, but then there's clearly this big spread in paths into language. Well, I got thinking, well, how big is that spread of paths into language? Well, why don't we quantify the deviation from the median? This is basically just looking at the standard deviation. There's some kind of mechanics here because it's not a normally distributed variable, but it's basically look at the coefficient of variation across kids within a language. How variable are 2-year-olds? Well, they seem really variable. Turns out this standard deviation is as big as the median, or mean. I'm going back and forth between parametric and non-parametric stats. The standard deviation is as big as the mean. The mean absolute deviation is as big as the median. So if you're kind of sampling 3 2-year-olds, one of them is going to know like 30 words, one of them is going to know like 150, and one of them is going to know like 300 or something. There's going to be really big variation. And that's kind of like if you go to a preschool classroom, some kids are going to be talking up a storm, and others just don't say that much. And it's not that all the ones that don't say that much have language delay. Many 2-year-olds, and we don't recommend any kind of clinical referral before 2, because not talking before 2 is kind of fine as long as you're otherwise on track. kids take different paths into language. After 2, you start to worry, and this kind of 10th percentile line becomes clinically meaningful, and you start to want to refer these kids up here. But down here, like, you're not really differentiating that kid from this kid a quarter inch higher. So, okay, that's the observation with American kids. How variable is toddler variability? That's what I ask you, right? You can play this both ways. Again, I think it's more compelling than the socioeconomic status one, right? Well, the US is a very big place, and there are kids growing up in very different circumstances with very different attitudes towards parenting, different backgrounds. Maybe that variability is a function of our wide environmental variability. And just to anchor you, maybe in Beijing, collecting a sample of first children with radically constricted sets of options in terms of caregiving, early child care, socioeconomic outcomes for the parents, maybe that variability is going to be constricted. Other argument, maybe variability is inherent to the language learning process. Maybe this is about the motivational structure of kids. Some kids really want to talk really early and some kids don't. Some kids are kind of plugged into the social world and want to communicate. Some kids find alternate strategies. Some kids are speech motor, if not delayed by a clinical measure, at least variable and have more trouble producing speech, and so kind of hit that virtuous cycle a little bit later. So what do you think? Is variability itself variable or consistent? Okay, I'm glad I got a range. It's really consistent. It's shockingly consistent. So this is that, call it the MADAM, the mean absolute deviation divided by the median, which is, it's just the coefficient of variation. It's just how big is the standard deviation. And from about 12 months to about almost 24 months, it's 1. And this is like a lot of languages. And then it dips here. Now, I'm not going to show you this because it's kind of a geeky analysis, but this is all ceiling effects. So if you use those IRT models and you plot the variability in latent ability, which doesn't have those ceiling effects, the variability stays the same size. Happy to expand on that if anybody cares, but I've satisfied myself at least that this dip is ceiling effects. This consistency in the variability maintains up to at least about 30 months in these data. So around the world, toddlers are all over the place to the same degree. So I think that's pretty cool and surprising, especially from the perspective of somebody for whom environmental determinants of learning were kind of thought to be primary. I was thinking it matters what's in that external environment, and I don't think these data speak particularly against that, but I do remind us that there are other determinants of the trajectory of learning beyond the environmental. And as with, this is not a behavioral genetics study, but as with any kind of behavioral genetics study, the flip side of population variability is environmental variability, right? So that in a more variable environment, we might find larger environmental effects. In other words, if we had kids who were suffering from stunting or severe environmental deprivation, we could see environmental variability reflected in here. These are largely kids growing up in pretty supportive households who are taking part in these studies. But that with that caveat, there's a lot of variability, and that variability isn't varying across cultural contexts, which I think is thought-provoking from that perspective. So I was excited about this result. Okay, now on to the two kind of theoretical issues that I introduced earlier, noun bias and grammar lexicon. Let me summarize that. This is just to convince you further that consistency in variability. This is that's that coefficient of variation, and 1 is kind of where you see all of these languages and forms lining up. Okay, so on to the noun bias. So one way of capturing the noun bias is this analysis that I showed you, where you see nouns kind of overrepresented relative to the number of nouns that you might expect, which is the dashed line. Let's summarize that instead by plotting the proportion of nouns or predicates or function words as a function of the proportion of total vocabulary. So the idea is, if you're above the diagonal here, your nouns are growing kind of faster than the rest of the vocabulary. If you're under the diagonal here, like function words, you're underrepresented compared to where you should be. as a category. So these are the American English data. Nouns are somewhat overrepresented, predicates are a little under at the beginning, then they catch up, and then functional words are way underrepresented, which is, makes sense, right? Your kid doesn't go around saying under as their second word or third word, they're saying ball and dog.
So I'm a little confused about the x-axis here. There's a time component?
So what I'm doing is I'm taking, for each kid, they have 680 yeses or nos on this form, and I'm taking their proportion on that and plotting it by their proportion on just the target, so nouns. So if you knew 10 words and all of them were nouns, you'd be kind of way up there. So you'd be super overrepresented on nouns compared to total vocabulary.
So the x-axis is just total vocabulary size?
Yeah, so there's no age in here. This analysis in some way kind of corrects for age in a loose way. So yeah, so that's kind of one way of representing this noun bias that deals with the age issue to a certain extent. So when you plot the noun bias across languages, here's what you get. So these are ordered by noun bias. So first thing I want to orient you to is nearly all of the languages, basically all of the languages have a numerical noun bias in them. So that's interesting and that's consistent. On the other hand, the magnitude of that noun bias is different across languages. Now, if you look at the top 4 here, say it's German, Korean, Danish, and American. So you've got 3 kind of Germanic family and Korean. Now, Korean is interesting because it's an East Asian language. In fact, an East Asian language that had even been argued not to have a noun bias. But this is 2 fairly large, one very large, one sort of 200 kid, so 1,000 kid and a 200 kid study of Korean, both showing a noun bias in production. On the other hand, here's Cantonese, Mandarin, and 2 different varieties of Beijing Mandarin. They have almost no noun bias.
Are these biases also reflected in like adult speech? So for instance, people that speak German, would they also have a noun bias that is larger than somebody that speaks Mandarin?
Yeah, good question. These are type biases rather than token biases. So it's the number of nouns that you know rather than the proportion of nouns in the speech you produce. So I don't know whether kind of German is a nounier language in terms of just like, in each sentence there tend to be more nouns. I'm not sure about that. Adult vocabulary is notoriously hard to pin down, not least of which because some languages like German make up new nouns all the time by compounding. But even impoverished English has these questions about whether we, are using a word as a noun or a verb like Google, and has issues of stemming and lemmatization, like do Google and Googles, the plural of Googles, not the verb form, does that count? Right, so there's all these problems in assessing adult vocabulary that make it tough to say whether adults have more nouns or verbs in different languages. So I don't know of a study that could address that without issues, but it's an interesting question whether they reflect later biases. Other thing I want to point out is they're not that big, these biases. Like anchor you, here's English, right? And I was showing you this, that's what 10% bias looks like. It's not a huge effect. Actually, when you look at predicates, they're much more variable. They're kind of more centered around 0 with a bunch more negative and a few, especially Cantonese and Mandarin, actually positive. So that's kind of where the action is actually whether you know more predicates than you'd expect or fewer predicates than you'd expect. And here Korean's got this negative bias, but there's kind of Australian English and European Spanish and stuff that are kind of more in the 0 range, and then there are these couple of really predicate-heavy languages. So that's pretty interesting, I think. To me, this suggests that these consistencies in early nouns may actually be subject to some of the kind of division of dominance type arguments, like nouns just are pretty easy to learn. They're present in the early vocabulary of many, many kids. But the predicate stuff may actually reflect more culturally variable factors like linguistic structure, parenting style, interaction style, the things we highlight for kids, so forth.
You
said here that because you're doing proportion of total vocabulary, it's sort of like a quasi-proxy for correcting for age. But might this not look different at different points in the acquisition string like it does for age?
Yeah, great question. So I've done a median split on age for all of these languages, and surprisingly, there's almost no difference on these two measures in terms of developmental changes. There's some sparsity there because if you kind of imagine, most of the young kids are kind of down here, and so you have to kind of just connect the curve up and hope for the best, and most of the old kids are up here and you have to connect the curve down. So there's some error issues, but no, there's not a huge effect. Theoretically, there could be a huge effect, and when you do this for function words, you actually do see it. So young kids are way more negatively biased on function words than older kids, but the noun bias and predicate biases don't seem to be that affected developmentally. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
You mentioned that that for those words that you just showed, I'm not sure if the lemma or root word that you mentioned before was in reference to that, and I was just wondering if those slopes have anything to do with those languages relative, kind of like clustering of morphology on different lexicons.
Yeah. So when we talk to parents about these forms, the general instruction is actually, if your kid says anything like this that means this, go for it, check it off. You know, and the examples that we give in English are things like if your kid says raff, but they mean giraffe and they're pointing at the giraffe, check it off. And I don't know if they explicitly mentioned plurals in this case, but you know, that's the general idea. For verbs as well, that you know, if they're saying walk or walks or walked, you should check walk. And then in the grammar section, there's a subsection called word forms where you say, does your kid sometimes say walked, or do they only say walk? I walk, or I, you know. So there's an attempt in the reporting to get around type token, sort of lemmatization issues. It's unclear how successful that is across languages that vary in the amount of morphology they have, but we kind of generally give them the benefit of the doubt there. Okay, grammar in the lexicon. So Bates argued from her data on English, and I believe Italian at one point, that there was this striking correlation between the number of words you knew and your success in combining those words into grammatical strings. What does that look like across languages? Man, was Liz Bates right. The R squared here for 9 languages ranges between 0.87 at the low end and 0.94 at the high end. It's really correlated. Across these different languages, parents are saying that their child combines words much, much more as their child produces more distinct word types. Now, somebody asked about age components there. This relationship holds across ages, but interestingly, there is an interaction term which to our knowledge nobody noticed before, which is that you need fewer units vocabulary per unit grammar if you're older. So what does that mean? This slope gets steeper for older kids. You don't need to produce as much language before you can combine. Now, why is that? I think there are a lot of potential stories you could tell. One that's consistent with those data that I like is if you've got better working memory, better generalization, you need kind of fewer exemplars in order to make a grammatical generalization and produce it successfully than if you're younger, where you're getting kind of more data that is going to support that grammatical generalization. Now, that's just one story, but I think it's a kind of fun one to tell here. And that age interaction is actually extremely consistent across languages here, and it tends to be bigger for grammar than it does for morphology. So morphology, your unit morphology per unit vocabulary is about similar with age, but that slope gets steeper for grammar. Yeah.
So in the CDIS, I understand there's no distinction between producing words and gesturing a word that is known. The parent counts as a word that the child produces, or just understands if they can gesture it.
I don't know that they would So the instructions typically are with respect to spoken language. So the early form is called words and gestures because there's a separate subsection at the end that lists a number of common gestures that is distinct from lexical items. So you would check off my child can wave hello, but you wouldn't check off hi for my child says that. Right. Would you check understands? I bet you'd probably use the presence of that gesture when you say hi as evidence for understanding it. So I guess you'd probably check hi. But no, in general, the instructions are about spoken language. So I don't think, especially for the later form, I don't think you'd get confounding of gesture, idiosyncratic. Like if I, do this gesture as my own butterfly gesture, I wouldn't be checking off butterfly on the form.
Yeah, I was just thinking of it in the context of, let's say, Susan Bowen Meadows' findings that combinations of speech and pointing gestures are predictive of going to the next stage of language acquisition.
Yeah, there are a bunch of possible explanations of this. This correlation is that kids that blend individual words and communicative gestures, especially pointing, want, those blends are kind of predictive of later vocabulary, and then also kids, parents who gesture back and forth together tend to learn faster. So there's kind of a bunch of facilitatory work that gesture may be doing correlationally, at least. My internal story is kind of similar to the one that I gave on gesture, which is I think that the engine at the heart of early language, and also maybe in the heart of some of its variability, is early social cognition and orientation towards other people. And so my internal story, without tons of evidence, is that kids who are interested in communication are developing these strategies, and that's kind of signaling a predictive relationship to later language and input and so forth. Okay, so grammar in the lexicon, exceedingly consistent across languages. Okay, so I've shown you a bunch of phenomena, not all of the phenomena that we've quantified, but a good range of them. And my promise to you was to place them on a continuum. The statistical approach here is now pretty simple. We're just literally defining a measure and then measuring its variability across the languages in our sample. Now, there are different numbers of languages in pretty much each of these analyses. So there's a number of grains of salt that need to be taken, but that said, here's the reveal. This is the pattern of consistency and variability across phenomena. So let me highlight the most consistent, toddler variability. Toddlers are variable consistently. Grammar vocabulary relationship, also extremely consistent. Demographic factors, the female advantage, I think this guy right here is pretty consistent. College advantage, less consistent, it's more variable. The firstborn advantage is more variable still. I don't know why that is, but firstborn kids do have an advantage, but it appears to vary across the languages in our sample. And we could speculate about sociocultural issues here. We could also talk about family composition, which is an obvious confounder, and I don't have an answer there. The noun bias, interestingly, is pretty consistent. Not as consistent as the negative bias against function words. Function words are just hard. They don't independently carry meaning. They only carry meaning in the context of composition of words. You're going to be biased against them as a learner. That's just true for everybody. Your language may not have a lot of function words. It's still hard to learn the ones that you have. And the noun bias is pretty consistent, and predicate bias is not. Predicate bias is quite variable, suggesting this is really a locus for cross-linguistic and cross-cultural difference. Okay. Let me now shift gears and show you a slightly different approach to these data. It'll be the last approach, and it's kind of a consistent section. We have a little bit of time, right? So we have
we have 27 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. So I've been doing this kind of piecemeal approach to individual phenomena to kind of replicate a particular phenomenon and then show you its consistency and variability. Now I want to take a more global approach to trying to predict developmental outcomes for individual words. And the inspiration here is a paper by Goodman, Dale, and Lee. They did a couple things that were pretty cool. The first of which is they broke down the CDI by items. So they said, let's look at individual words and let's try to predict, or let's try to actually just measure their relationship in terms of their age at which they're acquired to that word's frequency in children's input. So frequency is widely acknowledged by folks studying learning mechanisms to be an important driver of uptake. The more times you hear a word, the more likely it is that you learn it. But the second cool thing that Goodman, Dale, and Lee did is they mashed up two different large data sets. So their age of acquisition estimates were from the CDI. Their frequency estimates were from a whole different data set, CHILDIS, the Child Language Data Exchange corpus, where they were taking all the American English learning kids in the corpus and getting an estimate of how often words were said to those kids who weren't the kids whose acquisition was being predicted. So this is like kind of central tendency predicts central tendency, which is kind of interesting. And what they found was that there was a pretty strong relationship, 0.55 correlation between parental frequency and the age of acquisition for nouns. There was a less strong but still quite highly reliable relationship for, kind of, say, closed class words, verbs, adjectives, all in the kind of 0.25-ish range. So that's pretty cool. So we were inspired by this originally to extend the approach to doing it concurrently in a single child. So this is a study that came out a couple of years ago from the Deb Roy Human Speechome Corpus. The first author is the unfortunately named Brandon Roy, who's not related to Deb, but was his graduate student and did the bulk of this work as his dissertation. So in the study, we took the age of first production for the child and tried to predict it as a function of the frequency in the child's own input before it was produced, as well as its length, so complexity in phonemes of producing it and the length of the sentences that it came in. And so we sort of generalized this predictive idea where you take aspects of the input and use them to predict the uptake. And the relative strength of the predictor coefficients then can tell you a bit about the information sources that are used by the child. So we're trying to kind of break down the whole CDI approach to a word-by-word prediction approach that can tell us a little bit about information sources for different types of words. It kind of gets towards a little bit of the, one issue with the noun bias, verb bias, which is not all nouns are created equal. Justice should probably be harder to learn in different ways than table. So we follow this approach for the Wordbank data. We can now create these age of acquisition curves for different words. So this is jump and dog for, in this study, 10 different languages. So you can see there's some kind of consistencies here at some variability. Dog's easier than jump, but English learning kids really like dogs relative to jumping. You also might notice that these concepts are realized phonologically in very different ways across languages. So in order to do this project, we're going to have to map a single concept to multiple different words. Now this is the problem of translation equivalence, which is not particularly easy, but we'll take a stab at it. So what we did here is for these 10 languages, we did a first pass set of translations, then we paid linguists or kind of linguistically sophisticated observers to check on the validity of those translations for child language. Now it's not perfect. We have what we call the tortilla problem, which is bread, English concept. Well, okay, technically that's pan, but actually maybe the cultural role is fulfilled by tortilla. Okay, now the opposite problem called the reloj problem, right? We've got watch and clock, which are both reloj. So this is not a one-to-one mapping in either direction, and we're gonna just ignore that for now. We know that there are these problems, but we have to move forward. We did our best. Okay, so there's these hand-check translation equivalents. We call them unilemmas for universal lemmas in God's language, English, or I mean the language of the people doing the work. So there, we do our best. And if you find problems in our unilemmas, please let us know. You can download these, access these, and help us with them if you want. If you know Croatian and know that that's not actually how you say baby toy in Croatian, great. Then we characterize the input in terms of the frequency of the words that we're interested in, the mean length of the utterances the words came in, their frequency at the end of sentences, which is argued to be a good learning cue, their frequency in their own utterance, which is also argued to be a good learning cue, how long the words are. Actually, this is now number of phonemes. We started with number of characters because it's easy and very highly correlated with number of phonemes. And a bunch of meaning predictors like concreteness, valence, arousal, and this wonderful predictor due to Lynn Perry and her collaborators called babiness, which is, does this concept remind you of babies? Bottle, yes, bottle reminds me of babies. Alligator, not so much. Okay. So we created this predictor set for each of the words and languages in our sample. Now we had to translate the meaning predictors, but we did that by just directly mapping them through the unilomas. Okay, a word about how we did this with Childess. We had to take, so Childess is this set of corpora online of different languages where parents and speech to children has been transcribed. Now, Childess has amazing data, but it has not been standardized. It's not particularly easy to extract data from Childess, especially at scale. You kind of just need to download a lot of files and write a kind of funny script to parse through them, and then the corpus changes because somebody fixed something. It's problematic. It's been problematic for us and other folks. To address this issue, we created a side product called project product, somewhere in between, called ChildessDB. So if you're interested in working with transcripts of child language, I encourage you to check this out. If we go over to our web browser, we can look live on the internet. ChildessDB is an R API where you can ask for tokens from the Brown corpus from the children at all ages and sexes, but only from Adam and only when he said dog and ball. So you can just ask for the data you want from this corpus and have it parsed. You can ask for it versioned, so you can ask for the same thing that you got last time if you want, or you can get the most up-to-date version. In general, trying to kind of make a coherent way of accessing these data. And you can also just play around. So for example, if you want to know about the frequency of a word in Childess, you can call up an interactive analysis where you can specify the particular word and the particular corpus and the particular role that you want to look into. And like with Wordbank, you can interact with these data online and kind of rebin them for kind of better summary properties. You can even share a bookmark to the particular analysis. So this is kind of a fun tool for browsing through input for children. Okay, so we stuck all these data into into essentially a large regression model, trying to predict the age of acquisition for individual words on the basis of the features of those words across languages. What we were interested in was the relative strength of these different information sources, which one was going to win. So here are the predictors. So what we find is probably the strongest predictor, strongest kind of three predictors here in the positive direction are frequency, concreteness, and solo frequency. So we find effects that if you're said frequently, especially if you're said frequently on your own, and if you're very concrete and easy to visualize or point to, you're going to get learned early. Babiness is also a pretty good positive predictor. If you're associated with babies, babies like these sorts of things, they learn them early. Chicken or egg, I don't know, but certainly true. If you are harder to pronounce, you get produced later. And if you're said in long sentences, you get produced later. So these are all quite reasonable. There's a small effect of final frequency and essentially no kind of emotional arousal and valence effects in this data set. More importantly, if you look at the kind of relative ordering and strength of these predictors across languages, it's extremely consistent. Way more consistent than you might predict by chance. So the correlation between predictor values across languages is very strong. In other words, frequency ranks above babiness for kind of nearly all of the languages and so forth down the line. So what this suggests to us is that there is tremendous consistency in the information sources that are used that different by children and that differentiate words from one another. Even though the actual set of words that's being learned, whether being combined, their structure, everything, all of this is differing, the information sources seem to be quite consistent. Okay, so to wrap up then, what we see is that along with things like the variability across of toddlers in the grammar-vocabulary relationship, the predictors of individual words appear to be extremely consistent themselves excuse me, across languages. So this is the beginnings of our attempt to place phenomena on this continuum of relative universality, relative variability across languages. And more generally, to zoom out, what I've tried to do here is to model an approach that I think is a little bit orthogonal to the earlier great debates. We try to address some of the same issues, but rather than focusing on, as a starting place on hypotheses about mechanism, instead we focus as a starting place on describing the relative consistency and variability of data across individuals, across cultures, and then we use those as constraints on hypotheses about process. So this is a model of one way to go about developmental theorizing from a data-centric perspective, trying to model an alternative strategy to gain traction on what I think are still incredibly interesting and important issues. Okay, thank you very much.
About 15 minutes for questions.
Just a real quick one. On the charts that you had, I think it was different languages and their relative. Is there any chance you can go back?
This guy?
A little bit further back. It was in the sort of near the middle of the talk. There.
Grammar.
That's it. The Cantonese and the Slovak, there's just a strange little dip on the right. Is that just a statistical artifact, or do they actually have lower grammar score?
Oh yeah, no, it's a good question. So this is one of these sort of statistical head scratchers, which is this is boring for 90% of people, but it bothers me. What sort of functional form do you want to assume in this relationship? Now, as you can see, or you might infer, we've pinned this on the origin. If you have 0 lexicon, you better have 0 grammar. That feels like a reasonable assumption. You can't pin on the 1-1 point, because it's not the case that if you have all the vocabulary on the form that you should necessarily have all the grammar. Okay, so it's got to wiggle some. Now, is this relationship linear? We don't think it should be. Okay, so if you make it quadratic, you get something, but it's clear that it's not completely quadratic because there's some deceleration up here at the top as you hit ceiling. So you need a 3rd order polynomial at least. Okay, but if you say it's a 3rd order polynomial pinned at the origin, you get like these little dips below 0. So what kind of functional form? It's like monotonically increasing 3rd order polynomial that probably eventually gets to somewhere around 1. It's like, I don't know quite how to specify that. So I'm a little bit embarrassed by that dip, but I haven't figured out how to fix it in a way that was convincing to me. If you have suggestions, I'm open.
Will you go into the noun bias?
Yeah.
So do you think that there's inherently a difference? So we know that children learn language through interactions with their parents and vocabulary and directed speech. That's very, very solidly related. Do you think that parents in German-speaking countries just speak differently to their children? Are they labeling more per se, or are they talking like in sentence? I know, like for in early intervention, we tell parents, talk slow and in short sentences, and that's kind of an American thing. And although that's not necessarily with typically developing children, do you think that there are marked differences like that in different cultures?
Yes, there definitely are. So one classic study of this was by Fernald and Morikawa. They compared Japanese and American learning kids at different ages in maternal interactions. And they set a context that was consistent. They were all in the Bay Area. There were sets of toys that were the same. So everything was the same. And what they found was that and this is, I think, mirrored in a number of follow-up studies, that the Japanese teaching moms were using more verbs. They were engaging in more relational structures with the toys. They were less likely to put the noun at the end of the sentence and prosodically accent it. In contrast, the American parents follow the strategy, which is like kind of instantly recognizable to American parents like me, which is like, here's the dog, look at the dog, what a dog, 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 dog. You know, it's loud, long at the end of the sentence and again. And that's our acquisition strategy for teaching kids labels. And that wasn't followed by the Japanese parents. So that was one kind of nicely documented example of what a bunch of ethnographies have also documented in much broader variation. So when you see kind of Eleanor Ox or Bambi Schieffelin's work on kind of communities that have radically different attitudes towards parenting and early learning, then you see even bigger changes in the way language is used towards little kids. That was just in kind of upper middle class parents in the Bay Area, just with different cultures and languages. So yeah, that's got to be some portion of it. And the piece we don't have here is the full input piece. We can say, and I didn't show you the graph, that the predictor set that I showed you across words actually is consistent in kind of predicting just nouns and just verbs. And the information sources are kind of the same across languages to a first approximation for nouns and verbs. So like nouns are very highly driven for frequency in the kind of predictor study. But the language set there is different, and I don't have Mandarin and Cantonese in there, so there's some work to be done figuring out the role of interaction style as it could be captured in a corpus, for example, in explaining these biases. So I think it's a good question, and interaction style probably carries some of the day here, but I don't know how much.
That was for Nolan who?
Morikawa, 93. Yeah. Yeah, Heather.
Can you talk about the salience part of the predictor model? You said arousal, but you didn't use the word salience, but it was like valence, I think was the word.
There have been a couple of papers that have hypothesized a role for emotional predictors, like these things are scary or interesting or negative or positive, and that those should be important predictors of acquisition, and they really weren't in any of these studies.
Okay. But it wasn't things like, salience is one of those things that you talked about. Is salience familiar stuff? Is it like loud stuff?
Yeah. So we don't have a measure that captures that kind of perceptual salience. The concreteness gets you some kind of, is this obviously visualizable in front of you? This is from the Brisbart concreteness norms. And that does capture a lot of variability, especially for the nouns. So, babiness also soaks up a little bit of the kind of bright colored and fun kind of, babiness gets you some of the preference of babies for mid-sized animals. And those are also kind of salient, and they bark and meow and that kind of stuff. So it's hard to decompose some of those perceptual things, at least in data at this granularity.
Have you thought about animacy as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. We have thought about it. Because it doesn't vary quantitatively across these words, it's kind of just a binary predictor. We probably should still throw it in. It's a good suggestion. There's a section on the CDI form called people, and there's another one called animals, and those are it's going to be a dummy code for those two sections, but we'll still get, I think, some predictive traction probably. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, we'll do that.
I was wondering if there was if it's possible that any variation would follow socioeconomic complexity. I'm thinking Hidalgo and Houseman have this like atlas of economic complexity where they like have measures the country level variables for the like socioeconomic complexity, which is complicated to explain, but like you could imagine like the more kind of niches and more globalized there are in a society, how globalized society is, the more sort of things, different concepts individuals have to look at.
I think that's a really interesting suggestion. So 2 things to note here. One is if you look at our language distribution, we're like largely weird.
Yeah, fair enough.
There's that's Swahili in a rural population. That's Kigiriyama. These forms have been used with a number of African languages, and we're trying to work with some foundations to get those data, and I would really love to increase that linguistic diversity, and then we'd have a little bit of traction for that analysis. That's what I did want to show you. I mean, I don't know if this is exactly the same question, but if you look at the psychometric analysis of curve slopes that I was starting with, this is literally just the book. So this book is just written as our Markdown script that compiles on the database at any given time. And so I can just call up the whole kind of set of analyses here. I'm just trying to find you a particular one that shows some of the kind of funny disparities. I think it's this one, actually. Yeah, so you can kind of, like, there are a bunch of these things that, like very badly performing items are ones where they kind of like clearly relate to the diversity of experiences that a child has had. These are, in the psychometric analysis, these are items with low upper bounds. In other words, items that are not known by many kids. And so there's like camping is in here, basement is in here, which is just a terrible item to put on here, like in California or something. Babysitter, nurse, country, sofa, walker, playpen, tuna, hen. Like there's a kind of a bunch of words there where you can make up very plausible sort of like life experience diversity stories. You're also probably looking at you know, the kind of weird performance of shoo, yum yum, vroom, baby, moo, which have kind of ceiling effects and perform very badly. And then mommy, daddy, bye, dog are just known by every kid and so also perform badly. So this is like, all the stuff labeled here is stuff that kind of performs badly from a psychometric perspective. Although you may want to kind of keep it actually on the CDI because it's weird to have a quiz on early vocabulary that doesn't say no, even though most kids know no, you still want to ask about it. Eric?
So I'm curious because you really talk about language, and the CDI has other items like gestures, imitation. Are those in the word bank that you've constructed? And if so, have you looked at how they play with word learning?
Yes. So yeah, you can kind of, this is like, for example, the ordering of gestures: nodding head, shaking head, pointing, requesting, waving, smacking your lips, reaching out, showing your arms, pick me up. So you can kind of see this ordering. And you can look at the correlations between these and vocabulary size. And you can see there's just a really strong age signal. So this is age versus produced gestures. You can tell that you're looking at kind of early draft material, but kind of there's a correlation with comprehension and there's a correlation with age, and both of those are quite strong. So there's a lot of collinearity here, and that reproduces kind of a lot of what's been said about these things. We should and haven't. I think this chapter draft ends with a bunch of regression models trying to sort out these relationships more, but I don't have the answer for you.
Then my other question is related, but so when people donate or provide their measures, most likely they've also collected that data in relation to other variables that are not the MCDI. So is there a way where they actually could also submit things like Bailey scale or like other
Yeah.
normed measures that could go on here?
Unfortunately, we found that they're too diverse for us to understand kind of how to archive them in a consistent way. So we focused more on accessibility and coherence rather than, like, we could kind of archive them in their own ad hoc formats, but then the data access interfaces that we provide wouldn't allow you to kind of get a handle on them. So we haven't dealt with those. It is a weakness, and it's something we think about a lot, especially when I think about adding atypical developmental data sets here, is that they're often expensive and kind of carefully collected subsidiary measures beyond the CDI, but we don't have a good way to put those in a coherent format so that they're comparable. It's kind of a challenge that we've faced. Yeah.
So when you go, you're just going to keep updating this as the responses come in from different languages, and so in the plots, it was clear you had some, like American English, where you had a huge amount of data, and then others, like I noticed you had Latvian, which is quite interesting, with presumably not very much data. Do you think the patterns are going to change in it? Do you have a sense from having been in the data so intensely that?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So this is a kind of what I'm coming to realize is a constant refrain in, you call this big data, I call it medium data, but in big data type enterprises, which is that you can't claim that your data set is big without thinking about the hierarchical structure that it represents. The diversity at the top level of the data set is the critical factor in terms of the generalizations you can draw. And so from that perspective, honestly, we're small data, right? We're n equals 10 or n equals 22 or something per language. Even if or culture, even if we're n equals 10,000 or 80,000 in a particular analysis for kids. So that is really something that I'm very cognizant of, and I wish that continuum at the end had error bars on it. I'm working on that, but it's a challenge to do that right. I do think, in other words, that many of these estimates will move, and I've seen them move a little bit as we get more data. The toddler variability, grammar lex stuff that's on the consistent side, I'd be surprised if that budged too far. The socioeconomic one will move as we get, because that's also based on sparser data. The noun verb thing has moved a little bit, but not so much, and now that's like n equals 25 or something. That feels pretty good. Some of them will move more though. So, and that is really an important thing to think about. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, that's all the time for the formal bit of this. We have the room. Please feel free to stick around and chat informally, but let's thank Mike Frank again.